What if silence isn't absence, but a kind of presence? What if some stories disappear not because they lack truth, but because they carry too much of it? It begins not with a bang or revelation, but with a whisper, a fragment, a career abruptly ended, a life unraveled not by what was done, but by what was seen and dared to be spoken aloud. Throughout the past century, certain individuals, pilots, scientists, doctors, teachers, even photographers, have found themselves standing at the edge of human knowledge. They encountered things that didn't fit the accepted narrative, and when they tried to speak, the ground beneath them gave way, not all at once, but with calculated precision. This isn't a tale of conspiracy. It's a meditation on silence, the kind imposed with gentle hands and cold laws. It's about the human cost of witnessing what others refuse to see. Commander David Fravor was one of them. In 2004, during a routine Navy training flight off the coast of California, he saw something impossible. A white, oval-shaped object that moved without wings, without exhaust, without sound. It hovered, darted, vanished, and returned in ways no known machine should. He wasn't alone. His co-pilot confirmed it. Infrared systems recorded it. Radar tracked it. And then silence. The official story shifted. Files disappeared. Fravor's career, once ascending, began to wither. Psychological reviews surfaced. Access was revoked. His name became a whisper in hangars and conference rooms. All for 14 minutes in the sky that rewrote everything he thought he knew about flight. Others followed, scientists like Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre, who found human artifacts far older than they should be. Nurses like Maria Gonzalez, who witnessed autopsies that challenged all known biology. Engineers, astronomers, and historians who each stumbled upon something not meant to be found. What connects them isn't just what they saw. It's what happened afterward. The systematic, near-invisible mechanisms of erasure, not just censorship, but character dismantling. Careers ended not with scandal or crime, but with quiet discreditation. Funding cut. Papers rejected. Access denied. These are not the fever dreams of the paranoid. They are carefully documented, cross-verified, and persistently buried events. And yet they refuse to vanish. Because the silence they left behind has a shape, and that shape is beginning to be seen. This 14-part journey isn't about proving the impossible. It's about understanding why some truths are too disruptive to allow. It's about the fragile bridge between knowledge and power, and what happens when that bridge cracks. We'll begin with the sky, with Fravor, with those 14 minutes that shook the air and fractured a career. And from there, we'll follow the trail through deserts, laboratories, hospitals, and classrooms, through the minds of those who saw too much and were punished not for being wrong, but for being right too soon. So ask yourself, if a story vanishes in plain sight, did it ever really happen? Or are we simply not ready to listen? This is a story about the cost of seeing, and about the quiet war against those who dare to remember. It started with a dot on the radar, small, steady, and fast. Far too fast. November 14, 2004. Off the coast of San Diego, the skies were calm. Routine training exercises were underway. Commander David Fravor, a decorated pilot with a sterling record, had flown countless missions, but nothing prepared him for what he was about to encounter. Flying an FA-18 Super Hornet, Fravor received an unexpected call from the USS Princeton. An unidentified object had been moving erratically over the water. No flight plan, no transponder, no communication. Just motion, unpredictable, intelligent, and unbound by physics as we know it. Fravor and his wingman descended to investigate. That's when they saw it. Hovering over the ocean was a white, oblong object, smooth, featureless, shaped like a tic-tac. No wings, no visible propulsion. It wasn't floating. It was holding position in defiance of gravity, with a stillness that felt aware. As the pilots approached, the object danced, not like a plane, not like a drone. It moved with intent, darting left, shooting up, dropping down, and stopping instantly without inertia. In human terms, the G-forces would have crushed bone and blood. But this thing didn't even ripple the air. Fravor tried to intercept. He turned, the object mirrored. He descended, it vanished, reappeared miles away in a blink. It played, evaded, and disappeared again. Every maneuver he attempted was met with something faster, smarter. Back on deck, the ship's radar confirmed what they'd seen. So did infrared video from Weapons Officer Chad Underwood. Multiple systems, multiple witnesses, all telling the same story. The evidence was irrefutable. At first, Fravor was debriefed as usual. Calm voices, professional curiosity. Then, everything changed. Within 48 hours, his flight logs were classified. He was ordered to sign non-disclosure agreements. His squadron was split up. The tapes, radar, video, audio, all vanished into the hands of nameless officials. The silence arrived not with force, but with form. Fravor's access to briefings disappeared. His security clearance was suspended. Whispers of mental instability began to surface in his medical records. Colleagues distanced themselves. He had become a liability. He tried to fight back, to speak. But every time he reached for the truth, a door closed. His flight career was over, not because of failure, but because of knowledge. Years passed. When he finally spoke publicly, it wasn't for attention. It was because the truth was too heavy to carry alone. Others began to step forward. Footage leaked. Questions surfaced. The silence began to fracture. But the damage had been done. A man with an impeccable record had been systematically dismantled, not for error, but for honesty. What does it mean when our best are punished for witnessing the extraordinary? What does it say about our institutions when their response to revelation is erasure? Perhaps the deeper question isn't about the tic-tac or even what technology exists beyond our grasp. Perhaps it's about how we respond to disruption. In a world built on certainty, what happens when something impossible lands in the middle of routine? Commander Fravor's story is not about aliens. It's about the edges of belief and the systems designed to keep them from expanding. Imagine a landscape untouched by time, dry earth, ancient sediment, and the quiet hum of discovery. In 1973, Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre knelt under the Mexican sun, examining tools embedded in volcanic ash. What she uncovered that day would not only challenge the story of humanity's journey to the Americas, it would end her career. The site was called Hueyatlaco. At first glance, it appeared to be another promising excavation. But as Steen McIntyre and her team applied advanced dating techniques, uranium series analysis, fission track methods, hydration readings, they arrived at an impossible conclusion. The tools were 250,000 years old. That number shattered everything. According to accepted history, humans weren't supposed to be in the Americas more than 15,000 years ago. Her findings didn't just stretch the timeline, they obliterated it. At first, her peers listened. A paper was drafted. A journal accepted it. And then, pressure. Suddenly, her dating methods were called into question. The publication was rescinded. The rationale? Vague doubts. No data, just dismissal. Then came the cascade. Research funding vanished. Access to laboratories was cut off. Universities that once welcomed her now declined her lectures. Invitations to conferences evaporated. She hadn't committed fraud or made mistakes. She had simply seen too far back in time. Worse still, anonymous critiques began to circulate. Articles questioned her competence, her understanding of geology. They accused her of misunderstanding her own data despite meticulous methodology and peer-reviewed precision. Other scientists, intrigued by her results, tried to replicate her work. Some confirmed her findings using different techniques, but most chose silence. They had seen what happened when someone challenged the narrative. Stephen McIntyre was reassigned to unrelated geological tasks. Her expertise in archaeological dating was quietly buried under bureaucracy. For decades, her groundbreaking discovery sat ignored, her name whispered only in footnotes or avoided entirely. It wasn't until much later, when new methods confirmed earlier human presence in the Americas, that whispers turned into quiet acknowledgments the evidence had caught up to her. But the system never did. She received no apology, no restoration, no recompense. The question lingers: why would the scientific establishment, founded on curiosity, turn against one of its own for discovering something new? The answer lies not in science, but in story. Our histories are not just facts, they're foundations. Change the story, and institutions shake. Textbooks must be rewritten, timelines redrawn, and some would rather silence a voice than revise the narrative. Dr. Virginia Steen McIntyre didn't lose her credibility. It was taken, not through disproof, but through dismissal. Her legacy is not a tale of error. It is a mirror held up to the fragility of consensus, and a warning. That truth, when inconvenient, is often buried long before it's ever disproven. In the silence that followed her discovery, there was a question, unspoken, unanswered. If truth threatens the story we tell about ourselves, who gets to decide which story survives? The hospital halls were quiet. Stainless steel reflected fluorescent light. Machines beeped in rhythm. And deep within Walter Reed Army Medical Center, Nurse Maria Gonzalez walked into a room that would alter the course of her life. It was 1980. Gonzalez had served with care and distinction for 3 years. When she was selected for a restricted medical assignment, she assumed it was a recognition of trust. What she encountered behind those locked doors, however, was beyond any medical training. There, on stainless tables, lay 3 bodies, small, delicate, humanoid but not human. 4 feet tall, enlarged craniums, skin like worn parchment, eyes deep and black, reflecting nothing. They were not mannequins. They were not test dummies. The procedures being performed followed precise medical protocols. Autopsies, biopsies, analyses of systems unfamiliar to earthbound biology, cardiovascular structures with no known parallels, lungs that seemed adapted to a different atmosphere, neural pathways that defied anatomical logic. It was as if evolution had taken another route entirely, and it had led here. Gonzalez took notes, quietly, privately. She believed she was witnessing a breakthrough that would reshape medicine. She thought history would honor her presence there, but when she cautiously reached out to a colleague for context, something shifted. The next morning, her clearance was suspended. Her access revoked, her assignment ended. She asked questions. The retaliation escalated. Accusations surfaced, medication errors, fabricated complaints. Her nursing license was suspended. Supervisors claimed she was unstable. Her personnel file was altered. Disciplinary marks appeared where none had existed before. When she sought legal help, the records of her restricted assignments had vanished. There were no logs, no pay stubs, no entry logs or badge records. According to official systems, she had never worked there. Then came the psychiatric campaign, forced evaluations, medications she hadn't consented to, efforts to convince her and her family that her memories were delusional. A quiet war waged in paperwork and silence. Years later, when whispers emerged from others who had seen similar things in military facilities, Gonzalez's story resurfaced. It found echoes. But by then, her life had unraveled. She never returned to nursing. Her health was damaged. Her credibility erased. Her experience reveals a chilling frontier, not just in science, but in control, not just of knowledge, but of reality itself. What happens when institutions don't just deny a truth, but seek to erase the witness to it? Maria Gonzalez didn't break any law. She didn't spread rumors. She watched. She documented. She asked. And for that, her life was unmade. This isn't just about extraterrestrial life. It's about human mechanisms, the levers pulled to control who gets to remember and who must forget. In her silence, another question echoes. If seeing is believing, what happens to those who believe what they saw, but are told it never happened? The lab was sterile, humming with quiet voltage. Oscilloscopes blinked, cooling fans whirred, and in the center of it all stood Robert Scott, an electrical engineer with top-level clearance, staring at a device that defied everything he knew about physics. It was 1987. Scott had been recruited by a government contractor for a classified project. The technology they handed him didn't come with schematics. It came in pieces, materials unlike any manufactured on Earth. Their properties were bizarre: superconductivity at room temperature, energy loops with no input, gravity fields that bent without mass. His task was clear: reverse engineer the impossible. Scott worked in silence, documenting his findings meticulously. His reports detailed energy systems with near-infinite efficiency, propulsion mechanisms that manipulated inertia itself. He wasn't just studying technology, he was glimpsing a future that had already arrived, and it wasn't human. As the project ended, Scott began reaching out to private industry. He saw potential: clean energy, interstellar propulsion. He believed the world deserved to know. That was his mistake. The shutdown came fast. His security clearance was revoked. His work history with the contractor disappeared from records. Colleagues stopped returning his calls. Then the deeper erasure began. Anonymous complaints were filed, ethics violations he never committed. Job applications were quietly rejected. His transcripts were altered, his professional certification suspended. Even his Social Security records showed gaps. It was as if he were being unwritten. When he submitted papers to scientific journals, they were returned unread. Patent offices denied his applications, citing vague national security concerns. Attempts to publish online were met with takedown notices and digital censorship. Agents visited his home. No warrants, just silence and seizures. Computers, notes, backups. His life's work vanished. Most devastating of all, he began to see fragments of his research reappear elsewhere, repurposed, polished, rebranded under new names, with no trace of his involvement. He recognized the equations, the mechanisms. But his name had been removed from history. He wasn't discredited. He was deleted. The silencing of Robert Scott reveals the sharpest edge of secrecy, the transformation of a person into a ghost. Not through violence, through absence. In a world where data defines identity, erasure is the ultimate control. And so we ask, what kind of truth requires the complete removal of its witness? If the future has already arrived, in pieces locked behind classified doors, who decides when, or if, we're allowed to catch up? Scott never claimed to have all the answers, but he held something far more dangerous: proof. And for that, he lost not just his career, but his place in the record of human achievement. The tragedy of his story isn't only that he was silenced, it's that he was silenced so thoroughly, we nearly forgot to ask why. What if the real cost of progress isn't failure, but invisibility? In the dim light of the National Archives, Dr. Eleanor Watson ran her fingers over a decades-old cable, the faded ink barely legible. It was a minor diplomatic memo from World War II, routine, overlooked. But something about it didn't fit. She cross-referenced it with a published history. The numbers didn't match. One inconsistency led to another, then dozens, then hundreds. Watson was a respected historian specializing in wartime documentation. Her research was grounded in facts, primary sources, authenticated records, rigorous comparisons. But what she found buried in the archives shook the foundations of accepted history. Key battles misreported, casualty counts manipulated, entire diplomatic events edited out of existence. Documents had been altered, not all, but enough to reveal a pattern. The inconsistencies weren't accidental, they were deliberate. She compiled the evidence, verified it, built a thesis that challenged the most sacred narratives of the Second World War, not to dishonor the past, but to understand it truthfully. And then, like others before her, she hit the wall. Her papers were quietly rejected. Journals praised her scholarship but refused publication. Conference invitations were rescinded. Her university, once proud of her work, declined to renew her grants. Then came the personal dismantling. Anonymous articles questioning her mental health, accusations that she was pushing conspiracy theories, archival access revoked. Documents she had previously studied were now missing or under review. She tried to warn others, some nodded in private, but no one dared step forward. The silence was learned. Watson persisted. She launched independent efforts to publish her findings, but emails went unanswered. Funding disappeared. Publishers backed out at the last moment. Eventually, even her allies stepped away, not out of disbelief, but out of fear. The heartbreak wasn't just in being silenced. It was in realizing that others knew, but couldn't speak. What she uncovered wasn't a single cover-up, but a mechanism, a system that quietly rewrote the past to protect the present. And that system had defenders in every archive, every press room, every boardroom. The most haunting part? She discovered she wasn't alone. Others had found similar cracks in the historical wall, and each had been methodically pushed into obscurity. The story of Dr. Watson is not one of revisionism, but of resistance. Her loyalty was to truth, not tradition, and that made her dangerous. History, after all, isn't just what happened, it's what's allowed to be remembered. So we ask, if our past is curated, edited for coherence, scrubbed of contradiction, how do we ever truly know where we came from? And who benefits from a version of history that cannot be questioned? In the silence that followed her exile, Watson left behind one last note. I did not lose faith in facts. I lost faith in those entrusted to protect them. Sometimes it's not the lie that's most powerful, it's the memory that's never allowed to form. In the stillness of the Mojave night, a faint shimmer moved across the stars. Professional photographer Marcus Rodriguez was no stranger to the desert's light, its stillness, or the subtle shifts in the sky. But this was different. He had set up his telephoto lenses to capture environmental changes near restricted zones in Nevada. From a distance, through a haze of heat and distance, he spotted movement. Disc-shaped craft, silent, luminous, drifting and darting above the dry landscape of Area 51. He clicked the shutter. Again and again. The craft hovered, then leapt into the sky in a blink, violating every rule of aerodynamics he knew. No wings, no engines, no sound, just movement beyond reason. When Rodriguez reviewed the images, he was stunned. The photos weren't blurry suggestions or tricks of light. They were crisp. The metadata backed them up. Coordinates, timestamps, exposure settings. The images were real. He reached out to media outlets, scientific institutions, aerospace contacts. He wasn't trying to sensationalize. He wanted to verify. Instead, his world collapsed. Federal agents arrived without warning. His home was searched. His cameras, computers, hard drives, all confiscated. He was charged with photographing a classified military zone, though he'd never stepped across a boundary. Detained, interrogated, told he misunderstood what he'd seen. Officials insisted his mind had played tricks on him, that his equipment malfunctioned, that he was unstable. When he was finally released, his life was unrecognizable. His clients were gone, his reputation poisoned, Galleries removed his work. Articles vanished from online portfolios. He tried to rebuild, retake the shots, but the access points had been sealed. Patrols now blocked the vantage spots he once used. The final blow came when he discovered his images, stripped of credit, reappearing in obscure defense contractor materials, blurred, rebranded, deniable. Marcus Rodriguez hadn't chased a story. The story found him, and it erased him. His crime was documentation. His punishment was disappearance. His case reveals a darker truth, that in an age where everyone holds a camera, real evidence is more dangerous than ever. It must be intercepted, reclassified, or destroyed before it can breathe. But photography is a stubborn medium. It lingers. Even in silence, it asks questions. What are we allowed to witness? And who decides when a moment is too powerful to be seen? Rodriguez never claimed to know what he saw. He only knew that it was real. And maybe that's why it had to be unremembered. Because a photograph doesn't argue. It doesn't theorize. It simply shows. And sometimes, showing is the most dangerous act of all. The hum of machinery was constant. Dials flickered, antennas turned, and the stars whispered back. At the Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex, Dr. Sarah Chen monitored the cosmos like she had 1,000 times before, calm, methodical, grounded in science. Then the pattern changed. It was subtle at first, a signal buried in the noise, clean, rhythmic, structured. Prime numbers, sequences of mathematical constants, information wrapped in design. This wasn't random. It wasn't cosmic background. It was a message. She double-checked the feed, the origin, the Vega system. Light years away, but precise. The signal carried data compression algorithms, error correction codes, intelligent formatting. Not just technology, intention. Chen followed protocol, logged her discovery, submitted her report. The initial response from NASA was excitement, a flurry of data checks, verification studies. Then, without warning, everything stopped. She was ordered to cease research. Her telescope access was revoked. Security clearance suspended. The signal declared classified. She protested. Quietly at first, then publicly. That's when the campaign began. Suddenly, she was accused of data manipulation, misinterpretation. Her research methods, once praised, were now deemed flawed. She was reassigned to administrative tasks. No telescope time, no access to her own findings. Colleagues distanced themselves. Requests to verify her signal were denied. Other astronomers were warned off. The narrative was rewritten. There had been no message, just noise misunderstood by an overzealous scientist. But Chen knew what she heard. And she wasn't alone. Whispered stories emerged, others who detected similar patterns, signals too precise to be natural. Each followed by silence. Each astronomer pushed out, ridiculed, or quietly removed from their work. Chen filed Freedom of Information Act requests. The response? No such data existed. Her logs, tapes, and reports erased. Even internal emails regarding the incident had vanished. What do we make of a universe that answers and a society that refuses to listen? The silencing of Sarah Chen wasn't about science. It was about control. If the stars held proof of other intelligence, that knowledge would shake the scaffolding of institutions built on certainty. And so, the signal became a ghost. The message became myth. But truth has a resonance. It returns, like an echo through the static. Chen once said, "We spend so much time asking if we're alone, but when the answer arrives, we turn away, not out of fear of them, but fear of what it makes us." In the end, the question isn't whether we've heard something out there. It's whether we're prepared to admit what we've already heard. It began with a pattern, quiet, buried in government budgets. Investigative journalist Lisa Martinez noticed inconsistencies in research funding, payments hidden behind vague line items, grants marked for cognitive research without defined outcomes. She had followed money trails before, but this one led somewhere stranger. Through freedom of information requests and careful interviews, Martinez uncovered something chilling: experimental programs exploring human consciousness, time perception, and psychic enhancement. These weren't science fiction fantasies. These were classified studies, funded by intelligence agencies and shielded from ethical oversight. She spoke with former researchers, subjects, analysts. What they described sounded impossible. People taught to perceive time non-linearly, trained in remote viewing, guided through controlled experiments where intentions seemed to alter reality. The documentation was meticulous, the results consistent, the implications staggering. This was not a fringe study. It was systematic, heavily funded, and years in the making. When Martinez approached editors with the story, responses were cautious at first, then cold. Publishers passed, citing national security risks. Networks dropped her projects. Former colleagues warned her, quietly, off the record. Then came the direct pressure. Government representatives contacted her employers. Allegations of unreliability surfaced. Background checks flagged suddenly. Her professional accounts were restricted. Clients withdrew. Speaking engagements were canceled. She tried to go independent, set up her own publishing platform, but payment systems blocked her. Social platforms shadow-banned her content. Hosting services cited vague terms of service violations. Her sources, once eager, now silent. Some had been transferred, others forced into early retirement. A few disappeared entirely. Martinez wasn't discredited in public. She was smothered in slow, invisible layers, until her voice could no longer be heard, but her notes remained. Her files, copies of copies, hints of a reality too large to name. What she uncovered wasn't just a set of experiments. It was a doorway, one that governments had tried to walk through and quietly closed behind them. If human consciousness can be manipulated, expanded, enhanced, what does that mean for free will, for truth, for control? Lisa Martinez asked the question that made her dangerous. If our minds can be shaped from the outside, who shapes the shapers? She didn't claim to have answers, only documents, only voices, only questions that refused to disappear. And perhaps that's the real reason she was silenced, because nothing unsettles power more than a mind asking the right questions at the wrong time. The classroom was small. Posters of Newton and Einstein lined the walls. Coils and circuits hummed quietly as high school physics teacher Robert Kim prepared his students for another experiment. But that day, something changed. Kim had always encouraged hands-on learning. In one session, while testing electromagnetic fields, he noticed anomalies. Sensitive instruments flickered when certain students were present. Equipment drifted off calibration, not due to malfunction, but seemingly in response to focus, attention, emotion. He ran more tests, controlled for variables. Again and again, students influenced the outcome of experiments through mental concentration alone. Random number generators skewed. Electronic circuits behaved unpredictably. Quantum measurements shifted subtly when students focused on them with intent. This wasn't mysticism. It was measurable. Kim documented everything: statistical analysis, video evidence, repeated trials with consistent results. He believed he had uncovered something extraordinary, proof that consciousness could influence physical systems. When he submitted his findings to educational journals, they were dismissed without review, not because of errors, but because of the subject itself. Administrators became involved. They labeled his work pseudoscience, accused him of exposing students to inappropriate research. His contract was terminated. Allegations followed: fabricated parent complaints, exaggerated disciplinary claims. His lab access was revoked. His research materials confiscated. When he tried to replicate the experiments elsewhere, he found that schools had been warned not to hire him. Even his students, those who had demonstrated the effects, were transferred. Their families relocated. Contact was severed. Kim had not broken laws. He had not endangered anyone. He had simply explored a question: can the mind affect matter? The system's answer was swift and final: no. Not because it wasn't true, but because it couldn't be allowed. Kim's story isn't about psychic powers. It's about the fear of potential, of what it would mean if consciousness, attention, and intention had agency in the physical world. If thoughts can move electrons, what else might they move? The silencing of Kim shows how educational systems don't just teach, they gatekeep. They shape the edges of inquiry. And when something slips past those edges, it's not explored, it's erased. In a journal he never got to publish, Kim wrote, "We prepare students to ask questions, but only the right ones, only the ones that don't change the rules." His findings remain unpublished, his students' abilities unstudied, his career dismantled. But the question still lingers, unanswered. What if belief isn't just in the mind? What if it's a force waiting to be understood? The emergency room lights were harsh, monitors pulsed, bodies moved in crisis. And in the middle of it all, Dr. James Patterson noticed something he couldn't explain. Patients with catastrophic injuries, spinal cord severances, organ damage, blunt trauma beyond survival, were walking out of his hospital alive and whole. At first he assumed error, misdiagnosis, then coincidence. But as the cases piled up, the pattern grew undeniable. Some individuals were healing at rates far beyond anything recorded in medical literature. Tissues regenerated, organs repaired, nerve pathways rerouted themselves without intervention. Patterson did what any good doctor would. He documented. Imaging, labs, recovery timelines. Everything was clear, clinical, precise. He cross-checked with colleagues. Their responses were cautious, then evasive. When he submitted his findings to medical journals, rejection letters followed. Editors praised his detail, but dismissed the results as anomalies not worth publishing. He didn't give up. He designed protocols to study the outlier patients, but hospital leadership intervened. His access to records was revoked. Accusations emerged, claims of unethical experimentation, violations of patient consent. His hospital privileges were suspended. Then came the revisionism. Files were altered. It appeared as though he had fabricated data. Complaints appeared in his personnel file. His medical license was placed under review. The patients he had documented were transferred, some to military facilities, others simply vanished from follow-up. When he tried to contact them, no one responded. Some addresses were no longer valid. Phone numbers disconnected. Patterson's career crumbled. He wasn't dismissed for wrongdoing. He was dismantled for documenting something medicine wasn't ready to see: that the human body, in rare cases, could recover in ways that defied all known science. His silence wasn't voluntary. It was imposed through revoked credentials, frozen records, and a whisper campaign that painted him unstable. The deepest wound wasn't professional. It was philosophical. Patterson had believed medicine was about discovery, but he found its limits were not biological. They were institutional. He once wrote, in a private letter to a colleague, "If the body can do more than we've allowed ourselves to believe, then the boundary isn't science, it's fear." Why would such findings be buried? Perhaps because they challenge the model of medicine as external intervention. Perhaps because they suggest that we are more than we know. If we can heal ourselves, what else might we be capable of? The cost of asking that question was Patterson's silence, but the question hasn't gone away. It waits quietly in every unexplainable recovery, in every patient who defies the odds, not a miracle. A mystery still waiting for permission to be understood. There's a term used in intelligence circles, non-person. It doesn't mean someone never existed. It means they exist no longer in the ways that count. No records, no credibility, no voice. This was the fate of Dr. Robert Scott, yes, but it was also the unspoken endgame for anyone who wandered too close to the edge of sanctioned reality. And no one knew this better than Lisa Martinez, the investigative journalist who connected the dots others were too afraid, or too broken, to align. She had spent years documenting cases. Researchers erased, engineers discarded, whistleblowers gaslighted. But in chasing their stories, she found herself walking the same road. Martinez's turning point came when she discovered a thread linking multiple programs, military, academic, private sector, all exploring the boundaries of consciousness, perception, and cognitive control. Not merely studying these phenomena, but shaping them. She traced budget trails, gathered leaked documents, recorded interviews. Her work was solid, fact-checked, footnoted, grounded in first-hand sources. And then came the quiet unmaking. Editors pulled her features at the last moment. Publishers cited vague legal concerns. Her credentials were questioned by people who had once endorsed her work. Then came the shadow pressure. Emails stopped arriving. Her web traffic dropped inexplicably. Financial backers withdrew. Hosting platforms suspended her independent site. One source warned her directly, "You're not just reporting anymore, you're interfering." That was when the phone taps started, the inexplicable glitches, the whispered threats, never overt, always deniable. Still, she persisted, until one day her accounts were locked, her files inaccessible. FOIA requests returned with no responsive documents. Her name began to disappear from databases. Colleagues received warnings. Employers moved on. The final silence came not with a bang, but with disconnection. She had become what she had reported, a voice erased. But not before she left a trail, encrypted archives, off-site backups, private testimonies. Martinez understood the deeper reality. These weren't isolated events. They were a method, a structure, a system that doesn't need to deny the truth, only to unmake those who carry it. In a final, unpublished editorial, she wrote, "We think censorship is loud, books burned, stories banned. But the real censorship is quiet. It's a missing file, a failed upload, a name no longer found in the search bar." Her story is not just about suppression. It's about how easy it is to unperson someone in the digital age. When silence becomes a strategy, truth doesn't die. It's buried, archived in whispers. The question now isn't whether Lisa Martinez was right. It's whether we'll find what she left behind before it disappears too. Because in the end, every erased story leaves a trace, if you know where to look. The institution was ordinary. A public school with linoleum floors, fluorescent lighting, and bells that rang on time. But behind the door of room 312, something extraordinary was happening. Robert Kim didn't set out to defy norms. He taught physics with passion, Newton, magnetism, wave theory. But over time, strange things happened during lab experiments. Electronic devices misbehaved. Random number generators swayed from probability when certain students were present. At first, he laughed it off. Fluke interference, environmental noise. But the anomalies persisted, always tied to the same handful of students. Focused, attentive, somehow influencing outcomes with their minds. So Kim tested it. He designed controlled conditions, measured the data, repeated the process across weeks. The patterns held. Human intention, it seemed, could subtly shape the behavior of machines. He called it psycho-interactional variance. Others would have called it telekinesis. He filmed experiments, charted results, contacted researchers in cognitive science. But when he tried to publish, journals refused. Not with critique, just silence. Administrators soon intervened. He was told to halt his experiments. A parent had allegedly complained, though no documentation was provided. Accusations emerged that he was introducing unapproved material. His classroom access was restricted, lab equipment removed. Then came suspension. Soon after, Kim's teaching license was reviewed. Allegations surfaced, none criminal, all vague. Districts were quietly informed he was unsuitable for rehire. His students were transferred, their families relocated or silenced. The experiment was over. But Kim had glimpsed something profound. Not magic, not mysticism, but the uncharted frontier of human potential. A form of interaction that modern science refused to recognize. He once wrote in his personal log, "We teach science as a closed book, but perhaps it's still being written in the minds of students who haven't learned what's impossible yet." Kim wasn't dismissed for what he did. He was erased for what he discovered, that reality might not be as fixed or as limited as we believe. His story echoes those before him, scientists, doctors, pilots, engineers, all punished not for lies but for inconvenient truths. Each of them a fragment of a larger puzzle. Together they ask a final question. If truth bends the rules of what's allowed to be known, what happens to those who refuse to unknow it? Robert Kim taught physics. But in the end, he uncovered something even more fundamental. That belief, when measured, focused, and tested, might be a force we have yet to name. And perhaps that's why it must remain hidden. At least, for now. It ends as it began, not with an explosion, but with a whisper, a flicker, a question that refuses to die. 10 lives, 10 stories, 10 quiet disappearances beneath the weight of impossible truths. What connects them isn't conspiracy, it's consequence. Not what they claim to know, but what happened when they tried to speak. Across disciplines, military, scientific, medical, educational, witnesses encountered phenomena that shattered the edges of accepted reality. They followed protocols, filed reports, published findings, and in return they were dismantled, not through debate or disproof, through erasure. Clearances revoked, journals closed, careers ended, memories questioned, reputations destroyed, and always the silence that followed. But silence isn't absence, it's strategy, a mechanism of delay. Delay the truth long enough, and it becomes unprovable. Hide it well enough, and it becomes unbelievable. Yet the stories persist. They surface in old interview tapes, leaked documents, forgotten databases, in the quiet testimonies of those who risked everything not to be believed, but to be remembered. The lesson here isn't that the extraordinary exists. It's that when it threatens systems of control, it is buried, not with shovels, but with shame. We are taught that knowledge is cumulative, that science is self-correcting, that truth prevails. But history whispers a harder truth, that knowledge can be managed, that science can be policed, that truth in the wrong hands becomes fire. And yet, despite everything, despite the destruction, some embers remain. Commander Fravor still flies in our collective memory. Dr. Steen McIntyre's dates still echo through revised migration theories. Maria Gonzalez's story finds parallels in new disclosures. Robert Scott's blueprints are mirrored in unnamed patents. Lisa Martinez's files still circulate in encrypted corners. These are not ghosts, they are warnings. Warnings that the boundary between what is real and what is allowed is not fixed by facts, but by fear. So now the final question falls to us. What will we do with the silence? Will we accept it? Let it stand as a wall between curiosity and consequence? Or will we listen to the fragments, the erased, the impossible, and begin again to wonder? Because in the end, it's not just about what was seen, it's about who was willing to see, and what we are willing to see now. The story continues, in questions, in memory, and in the spaces where silence used to be.